This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, the high health cost of sugar. To one expert, it's a lot like one other source of empty calories.
Can you name an energy source that is not nutrition, that causes damage when consumed in excess, and we love it anyway, and it's addictive? And the answer is alcohol.
Obesity, diabetes, and sugar, when Radio Health Journal returns. I'm Reed Pence, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy Radio Health Journal, you'll also like Viewpoints, our sister show covering current affairs.
This week on Viewpoints.
It's not that philosophy is so funny. It's that jokes explain philosophical ideas and somehow make it funny.
Philosophy for the rest of us. We'll meet two authors who use jokes to confront the big questions.
Then, how a small town in Vermont became an Olympics powerhouse.
All that and more this week on Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station, iTunes, and Stitcher. The extent of America's obesity epidemic is indisputable. About 2/3 of us are either overweight or obese, and it's overtaken smoking as a source of health problems and shortened lives. But there's not a lot of agreement over how we got into this mess and what that says about how we can get out of it. The quick and easy response is simply to blame people for eating too much and exercising too little.
Everyone thinks that obesity is about calories, and calories are a math problem. You eat too much, you exercise too little, and after all, you eat too much, that's gluttony. You exercise too little, that's sloth, gluttony and sloth, two of the 7 deadly sins, therefore personal responsibility.
Dr. Robert Lustig is Professor Emeritus of Pediatric Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco, and author of the books Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease, and The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains. Lustig says the enormous increase in dietary sugar is the real reason for the obesity epidemic, and it goes far beyond the calories in sugar and other foods. But he says food companies love to make us think it's our own fault. It's a concept invented not that long ago by another industry trying to protect itself.
The tobacco companies in 1962, they were getting killed on the science, and they had to invent another reason for you to smoke. So they said, well, you get to choose. You get to choose if you smoke. It's your own choice. Don't put that cigarette in your mouth. Now, the question is it personal responsibility when the substance is addictive? Does that change the argument? Clearly it does, because every substance of abuse is now considered a public health problem rather than a personal responsibility problem.
So is Lustig saying that sugar is addictive? He says the evidence clearly shows that the answer is yes.
Sugar does every single thing to the brain that any other substance of abuse does, and that sugar also causes addiction in about 20% of the population. So people say, well, how can sugar be addictive? Sugar is a food. How can a food be addictive? You need food to live. You need sugar to live. These are the arguments that are brought out. Well, guess what? You don't need sugar to live. Not only do you not need sugar to live, you actually live way better without it. Turns out that the molecule in sugar that we love, that's sweet, that actually activates the reward center, called fructose, there is no biochemical reaction on the body that requires it, that when consumed in excess, it causes cell, metabolic, and human damage, and it's addictive and we love it anyway.
Lustig says there's only one other energy source that meets those same qualifications: alcohol.
Alcohol is not a food. No one would call alcohol a food. 40% of America are teetotalers, and as far as I know, there's nothing wrong with them. Maybe missing out on a little fun, but otherwise perfectly healthy. Alcohol is not a food. Alcohol is a toxin, and we regulate it as such. Turns out sugar meets every single criterion that alcohol does. So sugar is not a food either. And if sugar is not a food, and sugar does the exact same thing as alcohol, then sugar is addictive. And if sugar is addictive, then how does personal responsibility work?
But if sugar is the main cause of obesity, why has it been a huge problem only over the last 30 years or so? Granulated sugar has been in widespread use for hundreds of years, and it's presumably been addictive all of that time. So what changed? Lustig says two major things at about the same time. First, sugar got cheaper than it had ever been before. And second, experts and the government labeled fats in the diet as a far greater danger than they really are.
Those two things pretty much happened at the same time. So sugar got cheap because of something called high fructose corn syrup. And that was brought to our shores in 1975. And what that did was that provide competition for sugar cane. And it was a lot easier to harvest, and it was miscible in liquids, so it didn't crystallize out. And it was made on our own shores, and we didn't have to import it. So it was half the price of sugar, and so drove the price of sugar down. So all of a sudden, now, for the first time, sugar was cheap. Up to that point, it was kind of on the expensive side, especially since the tariffs kept the prices propped up.
The second factor was the very first U.S. dietary guidelines issued in 1977, which dictated that people should eat low fat.
Well, low fat tastes like cardboard. And the food industry went, what are we going to do to make people eat all this low-fat garbage we're making? Well, what'd they do? They spiked it with sugar. Because when you spike it with sugar, people come running. So they made an entirely new set of products, and they developed an entirely new industry around low-fat and fat-free, basically based on sugar as the substrate. So our sugar consumption just jumped through the roof, and in the process, we developed the diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, cancer, and dementia epidemics that we have today.
But Lustig says sugar doesn't have to make people fat to make them unhealthy. Take diabetes, for example. Many experts say obesity causes diabetes, but Lustig says that turns diabetes into a simple calories in, calories out calculation, which doesn't explain everything. It also lets food companies off the hook.
The food industry can invoke personal responsibility, like, hey, nobody put that Cheeto in your mouth. And if you don't exercise, it's your own damn fault. So this is a great way to assuage their culpability. So if it's about obesity, the food industry wins. But it's not about obesity, and here's why. Number one, there are countries that are obese without being diabetic, and there are countries that are diabetic without being obese, such as Iceland, Mongolia, and Micronesia are obese without being diabetic. India, Pakistan, and China are diabetic without being obese. If you have to have obesity for diabetes, then how do you explain India, Pakistan, and China?
And while obesity is increasing at 1% per year worldwide, diabetes is increasing much faster, at 4% per year. So Lustig says obesity can't explain it all. It also can't explain the diabetes increase in the United States.
If you look at the rate of diabetes increase in this country, it's going up 25% in the obese people. Well, guess what? It's going up 25% in the normal weight people, too. It's going up just as fast in the normal weight as it is in the obese. Well, if it's about obesity, how do you explain that? Well, you can't. Bottom line, it's not about obesity. The food industry wants you to believe it's about obesity, but it ain't. It's about our specific food environment, and it's specifically about how our body metabolizes the foodstuffs that enter it and what damage they cause in the process.
Lustig's conclusions are controversial, but he says there's evidence for them. He put a group of more than 40 obese children on a low-sugar diet and found that in just 10 days, their markers of poor health, such as blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood glucose, all improved significantly, even though the children didn't lose weight. So as far as Lustig is concerned, obesity isn't the problem. It's sugar. You can find out more about Dr. Robert Lustig and his book Fat Chance through links on our website, radiohealthjournal.net. Our production director is Sean Waldron. I'm Reed Pence.
Medical notes this week. We recently reported on the age that parents should consider getting their kids a smartphone. Now comes a study in the journal Emotion, finding that teens who spend more time on their phones are less happy than those who find other things to do. Researchers determined that teens who spend less than an hour a day on their smartphones are happiest. However, there's one large caveat to the study. Scientists admit they don't know if smartphone use makes kids unhappy or if unhappy kids use their phones more. Experts are beginning to realize that one of the more serious public health threats to the modern world is loneliness. It's a particular problem among older people, with studies showing as many as half of those over age 60 are lonely. Other studies are showing that loneliness markedly increases heart disease risk, depression, and cognitive decline. Now government is trying to do something about it. Great Britain has appointed a minister for loneliness. And finally, if you're tempted to stifle a sneeze, don't. The British Medical Journal has published the extreme case of a 34-year-old man who tried to bottle up his sneeze and ended up hospitalized for a week. The sneeze ruptured the man's throat after he held his nose and clamped a hand over his mouth, leaving the sneeze's force no place to go. And that's Medical Notes this week.
Thank you for listening to Radio Health Journal, a production of MediaTrax Communications. If you enjoyed this week's show, please leave a review on iTunes or share it with a friend. You can find more Radio Health Journal stories about health, science, and technology on iTunes, Stitcher, and at radiohealthjournal.net.